Why is trust in public health at a rock bottom? People like to look all outside of public health. They like to say it's those fringe elements on Facebook or YouTube. The Surgeon General's on the hunt for misinformation from big tech. Everyone says Joe Rogan and the people he platforms. And believe you me, I don't agree with everything they say, and I've written an article in Unheard magazine unpacking what's truth and fiction. But you don't have to look all that far to realize why people don't trust public health. I'm going to detail things that the institutions of public health, state, local, federal governments got wrong in this pandemic, and not just a little wrong, a lot wrong. Many times it was obvious to everyone that they got it wrong, and that's what's really eroded trust. So number one, masking. We all remember early March 2020, Fauci on 60 Minutes. I remember watching it. He said, don't wear community masks because you're going to touch your face and it's not going to have any benefit. And then 6 weeks later, the recommendation was widely that everyone should wear a cloth mask when they go out. It was a huge 180. And as a scientist, I know there was no significant information that occurred in those 6 weeks to prompt such a change. The change was prompted because of the precautionary principle and a strong lobbying effort to get cloth masks. The original policy was basically reflective of what scientists thought at the time, what meta-analyses had shown, what the WHO believed, and the final recommendation was we thought we'd give it a shot. And I actually don't have a problem with that, but I do have a problem with that they did that and didn't acknowledge the residual uncertainty and didn't run a cluster randomized control trial. But either way, Fauci, he said two things 6 weeks apart. One of those two things was a lie. He says it was the first thing I lied to protect the mask supply, but that doesn't make any sense because the mask they ultimately advocated for, a cloth mask, that's not the mask that you're competing with the healthcare provider. You wouldn't have had to take anyone's mask who was working in the hospital if you were going to go home and cut your sock off and cut the straps over or to cut your shirt. So that doesn't make any sense at all. I happen to think it was the second time that he embellished, and actually the first time he was more truthful to what he actually believed. But anyway, that was one thing. You're going to lose trust. You got to admit it. You can't do a flip-flop like that and have a story. And moreover, if Joe Rogan is platforming people who say incorrect things, why does the White House continue to platform a guy who told a big lie, a lie that he was caught in telling that would obviously erode confidence in many people? Why are they platforming him by putting him on TV all the time? Number two, the summer of 2020. We all know public health pundits had a total double standard. They were the kinds of outdoor gatherings that were acceptable in mass because they were for the right causes, and there were the outdoor gatherings that were not acceptable in mass for the wrong causes. We all know that. The next example, vaccine-induced thrombocytopenia and thrombosis, VIT. The J&J vaccine AstraZeneca had this deadly complication, which is a huge blood clot from runaway platelet activation in the cavernous sinus initially in women more than men, and it was initially found to be from the adenoviral vector vaccines, and it was found to actually be more common than that, men and women, and all sorts of places the clot could appear. It wasn't good. When I first heard about that complication, I thought that was game over for the vaccine. I think I tweeted something at the time. But meanwhile, public health, what did they say? They said, well, actually, here's a graph of how often women get blood clots in their leg when they take OCPs versus how often this happens from J&J. And, it's way more common to get a blood clot in your leg from an oral contraceptive, so this is no big deal. They immediately tried to downplay it. And in fact, I wrote early on that the CDC needs to rescind the approval of J&J. They still never did that. They took them many, many months, and then they ultimately actually downgraded it to being deprioritized over mRNA vaccines. They should have pulled that product off the market. There were available alternatives that were much safer, particularly for women in that particular target age group. That was a debacle. Once again, public health didn't want to have an honest, conversation about an emerging safety signal in the heat of the moment. That, I think, led to some loss of trust. The booster mandates. They really got the booster mandates through, and they got a lot of private employers to do it, a lot of hospital systems to do it. And it would have been one thing if they targeted old people and medically vulnerable people, but they mandated young people who work in hospital systems to do this. They mandated college kids do this. That was indefensible for a few reasons. Number one, you had the resignations of Gruber and Krauss at FDA. The number one and number two, people who'd worked there for decades, they resigned over that decision. How can you tell me that doesn't give you some pause, that the White House had pressured them so much, per accounts in the New York Times, that they resigned? Paul Offit, a man who makes vaccines, advises his own son, I advise you not to get this booster. It's not in your best interest. I don't have evidence it's in your best interest, let me put it that way. And yet, colleges and universities were mandating that for their own students, regardless of whether or not they had infection before. The entire way we treated natural infection, that's the next point. That was a huge loss of public trust. Paul Offit has now admitted that there's a straw poll. This was in a podcast with Z-Dog. A straw poll that the White House took about whether or not to acknowledge it or not, and it actually tipped narrowly in favor of not, and that led to the fiasco we're in now. How can anyone trust them after that sort of debacle? Bad mask studies. I've published so many Substack posts detailing examples of studies that are thought to support masking, community masking, and kids masking, but they just have a lot of structural flaws in it. What's the problem here? The CDC could have just done a cluster randomized control trial. You could have done several at different ages. It would have made sense. It's the reasonable thing to do. I don't know why they didn't. And putting forth a piece of bad evidence to support your policy, that doesn't build trust. The type 1 diabetes thing. They had that paper saying that kids who recovered from SARS-CoV-2 were higher likelihood of developing type 1 diabetes. It was grievously flawed. It didn't even just for BMI. And then, of course, the Europeans have a better paper showing that there's no link between having COVID-19 and subsequent type 1 diabetes. Yet type 1 diabetes is on the rise. Basketball rules. Oh, this is my last video. Those kind of everyday policies, the basketball rules, eating in restaurants, these kind of policies that just anybody with any common sense doesn't make a lick of sense. The guy can stand there on the side of the court, Kyrie Irving, and he can breathe on the court, but he can't play on the court. But when he goes to another city, he can play on the court. And when somebody else comes to his city and they're unvaccinated, they can play on the court. Come on. Are you serious? These are the policies that you have in place? And everyone is so worried about Novak Djokovic. Did he get the vaccine? Didn't he get the vaccine? He's a healthy 30-year-old guy who had COVID and recovered from COVID. That's not where our focus should be. Forget about him. Forget about him. He's not important. He's a celebrity tennis player. Forget about him. Focus on the old people in the nursing homes. Focus on what matters. Focus on lives that need to be saving. Why are public health getting so distracted by this guy? It's part of it makes people think you don't have your priorities straight. You're so rigorously focused on boosting young people and talking about this tennis player, talking about this basketball player, and this ridiculously, nakedly contradictory policies. You're not focused on actually protecting the vulnerable people who are going to get hit hard by the next wave of this pandemic. You look foolish. That's going to lead to loss of trust in you. Masking 2-year-olds. I really do think that was a bit much. The WHO are sensible people. UNICEF is sensible. They said, let's go to 6 and enough is enough. 6, even then, I think their guidance from 6 to 12 is, it's not 100%. They do say that, that you don't always have to do it, only if it can be in a tight situation, only if the person is quite compliant. Over 12, they say, okay, let's just do that out of the precautionary principle. But, they could be better. They could have actually done some randomized control trials too. And, but to go beyond them and to be such zealots about it and to take it down to 2 and to do it on airplanes and throw families off. What are you doing? What are you doing? I'm masking another 10,000 2-year-olds. That's not going to make up for not boosting older people, not vaccinating an unimmune 65-year-old person. That's not going to make up for that. You need to focus on what matters. Of course, people are going to lose trust in public health. You look like you're distracted by all these kind of virtue signaling things. You're not focused on the problem at hand. And then the conflict of interest. This is what I want to talk about in the last couple of minutes. You're marinating in conflict of interest, and that's a problem. And people are already seeing it, and I think they're going to see it more. One, you got people, epidemiologists, taking money from testing companies and then writing with those testing companies protocols and modeling studies to support the universal testing of kids on campus. Come on, that's got to be heavily biased work. That's not a randomized control trial. It's not a controlled study. It's a modeling exercise to support the routine use of that testing service. And they're taking money from the testing company. That's problematic. Taking money from teachers' unions and testifying to keep schools closed, that was also problematic. I think the Surgeon General had some problematic conflicts. He took $400,000 from Carnival Cruise. This came out in a Washington Post article prior to his appointment. And then at the height of Omicron, they're very happy to continue to mask very young children, but they allowed cruise ships to run. They actually said, at one time, the peak, I think the CDC said, was we discourage you actively from getting on a cruise ship, even if you're vaccinated, but they did not halt those cruise ships. You got this guy taking tons of cash, $400,000 from Carnival Cruise, and he is not pulling the trigger on halting that, he and the other people in the administration. You've got to wonder if that's the perverse influence of conflict of interest. You've got to wonder. And Steve Hahn is the FDA commissioner. Now he works for a venture capital firm with deep ties to Moderna. You've got to think about these revolving door issues. The last thing I'd say, Borla's out there in the news today, and he's announced that, we're going to have that fourth booster for 65 and up. It's going to get EUA. We've got all this Israeli data. This is not randomized control trial data. This is observational data from Israel. How many EUAs are we going to give Pfizer? Are we going to give them 7, 8, 10 EUAs? They need to do some randomized control trials. They need to fulfill a biological licensing agreement for these boosters. This is ridiculous. We are handing them billions of dollars, and we're not holding them to a rigorous evidence-based standard. So look at all these things. These are all the things done in the name of public health by officials. You don't need to look at Joe Rogan and all these fringe elements. You are dropping the ball. You are dropping the ball. And my focus is on you, because I believe institutions and governments and educated people need to do better than the random person on the internet or the random person have a podcast. I believe you need to do better. So I'm going to be on you. And you're the ones who lost the trust in public health. You don't need to look any further than that. Until next time.